I'm joined now by political analyst Sandile Swana just to reflect on the legacy, some of the statements that Jessie Duarte has made, fiery statements, as you heard throughout the day, labelled as a firebrand, somebody who wasn't afraid to speak her voice. Sandile, thank you very much for being with us in our studio today. What was so interesting for me was it doesn't matter where you look on the political spectrum, even those who have been the ANC's harshest critics and have locked horns not only with Duarte but with other members of the ANC, coming out and being able to reflect on just how formidable a leader she was and her clarity of thinking. Thank you, Iman.
The truth of the matter is that in many ways, Jessie was fortunate, particularly if you're a black person. You know, she was born at the time Bantu education was launched in 1953. So a lot of that generation had to, by circumstances, force of circumstances, to lead the struggle, had to be part of it. So none of us can deny those escapades, those confrontations with the system. So no matter what criticism one would have wanted to level at Jessie, the track record in the struggle and the success of that struggle in 1994 cannot be denied.
Yeah. You know, I was watching the grandchildren deliver that touching eulogy. It was a recollection of all her political milestones. So, you know, it kind of became a moment where her send-off became in part this nostalgic trip into the archive of activism and sacrifice of the party, the parts of the ANC that are really further from public view right in this moment.
Yes.
Do you concur with that?
Yes, I think that the thing about South Africans, a lot of us don't look at things from a historical point of view. Where did this thing come from? People are caught up in what is happening today. We don't really go into the nitty-gritty of what made Jessie Duarte and what made the UDF, what made eventually the ANC. These little scandals that we see and other failings that we see today do not actually reflect the true price that was paid for us to be here today.
I want to talk then because that true price was one, I think, that she constantly tried to reinsert into public memory. The many faces of Jessie Duarte is then what we see in public. Let's start with the rock that she was within. The ANC NEC member, TG Paul Mashatile, saying, you know, reflecting on her stoicism, talked about, you know, how she was resilient even in the face of her ill health. We heard earlier in the program from TK Nkiza, who referred to her as a mother figure, somebody who, you know, brought the youth in when they felt abandoned and depressed, and a being who could be trusted. So interestingly, in Nasrec at that seminal conference, by both slates, when she ascended as DSG on both slates.
Yes, there are personalities like that. Unfortunately, people like Jessie are not in the majority at the moment in the ANC, but they are there. Jessie was one of them who know that they will tell you the truth, whether you are this side or that side, they lay it on you, it will be in front of you, whatever it is that need to be in front of you. And unfortunately, we are now in the period where there's a philosophy of winner takes all in most of these slates. But yes, Jessie was that. And the other one that was emphasized by Dennis Bloom was the issue of love. That issue of being able to accommodate people even in their time of greatest weakness.
I mean, I'm just looking at the pictures we're showing our viewers now. I mean, look at that picture, so young, you know, and this is really in our democratic history, not too long ago, but there she is, and we'll talk a little bit more about the role she played along with Madiba and along with Walter Sisulu and how that really shaped her political career. But we cannot forget Jessie, the firebrand. Who can forget her famously telling the party in Soweto in 2019, this is not long ago, during the Albertina Sisulu Memorial Lecture, and we know she was one of Ma Sisulu's girls. Correct. Back in the day. That's what really also just springboarded her political activism around women's issues. But she said that the party was tribalistically chauvinistic. She also said that the party was racist, that we in the ANC are racist because we marginalize people who are not black African people. We keep them out of the ANC at all costs and put one or two people there as tokens so that we can say, Maraya, you know, there is Jessie Apa representing in the ANC. And I think the comment that Bongi made to me in that handover was, these wisdoms, these critiques of the ANC that she, vociferously voiced at many different points are things now, ironically, in her demise that perhaps the party is going to be able to consider as it finds an opportunity for another Damascene moment. Do you have a smile on your face? Do you disagree?
In this movement, let's call it that, ANC, UDF, and the Mass Democratic Movement, whatever you want to call it, Jessie had to raise that issue. Some of us forget that people like Gayton McKenzie were once in this mix. And we found a breakdown, almost a tribalistic, ethnic breakdown of the ANC. And this whole criticism that people bring forward to say that the ANC is for especially Africans and blacks in general, and so on, those types of things. And Jessie challenged that, and rightfully so, because the last election showed you a fracturing of people into cultural, localized, parochial type of groups that are very ethnic in background. And that you will probably find in the ANC structures as well.
And I mean, it's really hard to synthesize a life, isn't it? Because you take the best and the worst parts, and that makes the story, when there's so much nuance in between that story. 25 years on the NEC, 10 as DSG, navigating these choppy political waters, watching, the political fortunes of the party being eviscerated both through election numbers and scandals. She wasn't someone that was afraid to speak her mind, and you've made that point again now. What does this moment represent, both in terms of perhaps accidentally some of the political goodwill that exists in this moment for the party, the reflection on the lessons that she has tried to, to pass on while she was still alive? What does the ANC do with this moment? Is there an opportunity for them here? I mean, not to be opportunistic, but is there an opportunity here for them?
Well, the opportunity is already there. I think this gives impetus to that opportunity. I mean, in the past few days, we've listened to the presentation by Losi of COSATU at the SACP Congress. And I probably spent the better part of today reading the political report of the SACP. That candid honesty, which is precipitated by electoral losses. So when people like Jessie, who are unifiers, are going and so on, and the electoral pressures are increasing, because they're going to have about only 18 months from December to win an election. And right now, they are terribly divided. I think people had to force a lot of smiles at the symmetry there.
It's so interesting that you say that. And again, if there's any place to force a smile, it would be then at a cemetery, because you don't want to seem, ungenerous. But you reflect on the SACP, of course, they've just had their elective Congress. We know the relationship that Mr. Duarte had in particular with the SACP. These calls again, these ponderings about whether the SACP goes it alone as a party. And as we reflected yesterday on the program, this is not a new call. It's been years and years in the making. But it's a call that seems to reincarnate every so often, given the deeper frustrations and fissures within the alliance. Would you say these are real existential threats for that alliance?
Not the alliance, no. I don't think the alliance is under threat. These are bargaining tools and bargaining chips that the Communist Party often throws and throws its toys to get more cabinet posts and other things. And unfortunately, there are things that are very serious that the SACP is able to say that they've not been able to get the ANC to pick on those things and ride with them on the actual agenda of running the cabinet and running the affairs of state.
So again, going back to what this moment is, what it represents, we had a trip down memory lane, a look at her, her political activism and her career, where she's located inside the party. Some of these, and I'm going to talk actually to, hopefully, to the Jacob Zuma Foundation a little bit later on about where that loyalty shifted, in a sense, and was then firmly lodged behind Jacob Zuma. How would you say, I mean, what are the things you put together in that recipe or that synthesis of what her legacy really is? Obviously, it can't be determined in the moment. It will take a period of reflection for things to sediment. But what would make some of the attributes of that legacy?
I think it's complex. And I think to say there's people who were placed behind Jacob Zuma and all that, it's a complex issue. Because some of the people were actually affected in 1996 when the RDP program was jettisoned. And Zuma became a hope that they had, not the person. It was a hope. They already had the hope that they need to fight back against the neoliberalism. So some of the people who are said to be behind Jacob Zuma were actually against neoliberalism. There are those, obviously, who are personally, in the personality cult of the ANC, totally committed to Jacob Zuma himself. But we must not, and I would think Jessie's position would be much more different, because the recipe that has been implemented up until now, after jettisoning the RDP, has produced failure in any event. And they also tried to rescue it, and they produced more failure.
Right. I mean, it was interesting, though, because if I recall correctly, her reflecting on being sad at the fact that she had to stand in, and there's a picture there, I believe this is from today, you know, at the funeral service, Ace Magashule and the president of the party. We know that these have been tenuous times. She had to step in for him. And also it was a year, you know, last year was a really tumultuous year in terms of her own relationship with Zuma and that loyalty she felt with him when he had to be jailed, describing this entire period as sad. I mean, it's interesting on the day of her send-off, here's a moment together. I believe that's from,
Correct.
today.
Yeah, it is. Yes, the issue here, there are people, politically and from a statesmanship point of view, who would have said this whole hoo-ha of dividing the ANC, fighting with Jacob Zuma to the extent that has been done, and fighting with Ace Magashule, and all this thing that happened, people like Jessie would have said, we're actually going to destroy ourselves here. I'm certain of that. And they actually have. And those who continue to take that route are actually destroying both Cyril Ramaphosa's camp and destroying the RT camp. They are destroying the ANC. So the problem is that, and I think Oprimachik made this point, by saying that none of these people can approach this topic from a position of innocence. The people who are behind Ramaphosa, including Ramaphosa himself, is not innocent, just as much as Zuma is not innocent. So there is a domestic arrangement that they need to come to, and I think Jessie would have been there.
Yes, and I suppose, in a sense, also to kind of tap into the wisdom of Solomon at a moment like this, when there's so much at stake and a wise decision needs to be made about the way forward. We always appreciate your analysis, and thank you for broadening this picture and what this day means in terms of not only for the party's future, but also as we come to terms with what Jessie Duarte's legacy is. Political analyst Sandile Swana.